That's fucked up.
I'll be back later.
Welcome back, Warner fam. Today, we're diving into a chilling 2023 horror drama, Last Straw, so keep your eyes wide open and stay safe. The movie starts with Nancy, a young woman on the edge of something terrifying. She's just found out she's pregnant. Nervously, she confides in her best friend, Tabitha, her voice shaking. "I'm sure," Nancy says, her eyes avoiding Tabitha's stare. But when Tabitha asks, "Who's the father?" Nancy hesitates. The truth hits her like a cold wave. She doesn't know. She's been with a few men recently. Nancy's life is a blur of confusion, but she can't let it stop her. She works at a restaurant and has to make it to her shift. As she drives, the hum of her music fills the silence. But suddenly, thunk, the car sputters and dies. Stranded, Nancy is forced to walk. Every step is heavy, the weight of her secret pulling her down. That's when she runs into Bobby. He's her co-worker, always on his bike. Nancy's heart races. She can't afford to be late. Without saying a word, she hops onto Bobby's bike, gripping the handlebars like they're her only chance to escape. They rush to the restaurant. But as Nancy walks through the door, there's a twist. She's not just meeting her boss. She's walking into her father's office. He's the owner. And now, as the new restaurant manager, she has to prove herself. Her father doesn't mince words. She needs to be more disciplined, more responsible. The pressure is suffocating. As if that wasn't enough, her father mentions he has a date tonight. After years of mourning her mother's death, he's ready to move on. He asks Nancy to stay late, alone. The weight of the night settles on her shoulders. Later that night, as Nancy cleans up, she notices leftover food on a customer's plate. The sight of it makes her stomach churn. Without warning, she rushes to the back and vomits. Her head spins as the sickening feeling refuses to leave. Jake, the restaurant chef and her father's trusted right-hand man, is nearby. He watches her closely, his eyes narrowing. Could she be pregnant? But before he can ask, Nancy's father walks in. Jake quickly steps in, covering for her. "Spoiled meat," he says with confidence. Her father doesn't question it. The lie hangs in the air, heavy and thick. With her father gone for the night, Nancy tries to push through the night shift. But soon, Peter, a kind-hearted but mentally disabled employee, spills water on the floor. Nancy sighs, understanding. She doesn't get mad, but just as things start to settle, a group of teenagers roll up on their bikes. They're known troublemakers. And tonight, they aren't here to eat, they're here to cause trouble. Nancy steps outside, hoping to keep the peace. But the frustration from her pregnancy bubbles to the surface. Her patience snaps. She yells at Peter for not cleaning up fast enough. The tension grows, thick as fog. Then the teenagers return. This time, they're wearing masks. They pretend to order, but Nancy sees right through it. Their real goal is to provoke her. Her anger boils over. She shouts for them to leave. They just laugh, mocking her. When Nancy threatens to call the cops, one of them smirks. "We'll be back in 10 minutes, he taunts. The unease in the air is sharp, like a knife waiting to strike. Furious and feeling completely unsupported, Nancy lashes out. She doesn't just yell at the troublemakers anymore. She's furious at everyone. Her voice cracks as she scolds Bobby, Peter, and even Jake. She tells them they've all been standing around, doing nothing. Jake, the restaurant's senior employee, tries to calm her down, saying the kids were just messing around and that Nancy's overreacting. But Nancy doesn't care. She's had enough. In a split second, she fires him. The room goes dead silent. Everyone freezes. Even Jake, who has been her father's most trusted employee and the restaurant's head chef, can't believe it. He quickly apologizes, his voice desperate. "I need this job," he says, eyes wide. "I have bills, insurance, prescriptions to pay for." But Nancy stands firm. Without a second thought, she tells him to leave. After firing Jake, Nancy walks to the bathroom, her hands shaking as she splashes cold water on her face. She tries to gather herself, but it's no use. Bobby, trying to be kind, checks on her, but Nancy isn't having it. "Don't act like you care now," she snaps, her words sharp and cold. She's left alone to finish the night shift. With a deep breath, she picks up the phone and calls her father, telling him what she's done. He's stunned, his voice rising in disbelief. He scolds her for making such a hasty decision. "You might be able to handle the cooking," he says, "but replacing Jake won't be easy. The restaurant's already struggling. We can't afford any more mistakes." Nancy could have closed up early, but with bills piling up and no way to pay them, she has no choice. She has to stay open, pushing through the night until morning. Alone in the empty restaurant, the silence presses in. She tries to shake off the stress by playing music, cleaning up, and even dancing around a little, turning on the disco lights just for fun. But then, something catches her eye. Across the street, under the dim glow of the streetlights, she sees it. The teenagers' bicycles are parked there. They're back. Her heart races. Nancy grabs the loudspeaker and threatens to call the police. But instead of backing off, the masked teens just laugh. And then, with a loud crash, they start slamming their fists against the windows. Harder, louder. The sound is deafening, shaking the walls. Panic grips her. This time, she doesn't hesitate. She calls the police, but the answer she gets isn't what she hoped for. All units are occupied with a murder case, the dispatcher says coldly. It may take some time to send someone. We can only send one officer. One officer. That's it. Nancy's stomach sinks. She's all alone. With no choice left, she watches the masked teens circle the restaurant, moving like predators. Then, the real terror begins. While hiding in the kitchen and frantically searching for her phone, Nancy hears something distant, the sound of a police siren. Relief floods through her chest. Help is finally here. A police officer steps out of his car and begins patrolling the area. As he walks, he notices an open water tap, as if someone had just used it. He reports back to headquarters, assuring them that everything seems calm for now. Nancy rushes out, desperate to explain. It's the teenagers. They're on mopeds, wearing masks. But when the officer hears her, his face shifts. Those kids, he recognizes them. They were just involved in the brutal murder he had been investigating. Nancy's stomach churns. The officer, trying to keep his voice steady, admits he had just left the crime scene. Those same masked teens, terrorizing her now, were behind something much worse. Before he can say anything else, bang! The officer collapses as a masked teenager storms in and kills him on the spot. Nancy barely has time to react. Her heart races as she sprints to the storage room and hides, her breath shallow and fast. Just as she's about to breathe a sigh of relief, Bobby appears. Without thinking, she grabs him and pulls him into the kitchen, hoping to stay hidden. But it's too late. The teenagers have found them. Nancy and Bobby are forced to sit face to face, tightly tied up. The attackers have fun at their expense, making them kiss as part of their twisted game. Nancy refuses to give in. She struggles, fighting with every ounce of strength she has. But the masked figures aren't done. They drag her to the back of the restaurant, anger flashing in their eyes. Nancy's spirit won't break. In a desperate move, she breaks free, grabs a knife from the counter, and slashes one of the attackers. With the blade in hand, she bolts out of the restaurant, adrenaline pumping through her veins. One of the teenagers chases her down, racing on a moped. Nancy keeps moving backward, gripping the knife tightly. Every step feels like it could be her last. But in the chaos, her heart stops. She accidentally stabs Peter. The shock is instant. What did I just do? Before she can even process it, the horrifying truth hits her like a ton of bricks. Jake, Bobby, and Bobby's brother Jackson were behind it all. To understand how everything turned into this nightmare, we need to go back to the afternoon when Nancy fired Jake. Jake wasn't just a bad employee. He was a drug addict. He didn't need his job to pay bills or survive. He needed it to feed his addiction. Peter, Jake's younger brother, had always been forced to listen to him no matter what. That afternoon, they went to buy drugs from a dealer. Jake, out of money, showed a gun he kept in his car's glove box and begged for credit. On the way back, high and unstable, Jake spotted a group of masked teenagers by the roadside, having a bonfire. He pulled over, but he wasn't there to join in. He was there to blame someone. In his foggy mind, he believed that if the teenagers hadn't come to the restaurant, Nancy wouldn't have gotten angry, and he wouldn't have lost his job. His rage exploded. Without thinking, he stabbed one of the teens and then opened fire, killing the rest in a wild, brutal frenzy. The worst part? Peter, who didn't want any part of it, was forced to go along with his brother's madness. After killing the teenagers, Jake and Peter loaded the mopeds and masks into their car. Jake then ordered Peter to go to the restaurant, while he headed to Bobby and Jackson's house. Still furious about Nancy's frustrating behavior, Jake came up with a twisted idea to prank her. He wanted to disguise himself and Peter with masks and mopeds. Bobby and Jackson, always looking for chaos, were quick to jump on board. Bobby did ask where the masks and mopeds had come from, but Jake, keeping his dark secret, casually said he borrowed them from some teenagers hanging out nearby. Meanwhile, Peter had already reached the restaurant. He noticed his hands still covered in blood from the horrible things he had just done. In a panic, he rushed to the back and frantically scrubbed his hands clean at the water tap, the same tap the police officer would later notice. Soon after, Jake, Bobby, and Jackson arrived at the restaurant, ready to make Nancy's night a living nightmare. They banged on the windows, lurked in the shadows, and did everything they could to scare her. As we saw earlier, their plan worked. But just when things seemed to be getting worse, the police officer showed up. Immediately, the group scattered and hid, watching as Nancy and the officer discussed the murder case. Jake, fearing he would be exposed, snuck up behind the officer and struck him down. That was the moment Nancy ran to the storage room, heart racing with fear. Bobby, watching everything unfold, started to feel guilty. Unlike the others, he hadn't expected things to get this out of hand. In a split-second decision, he pulled off his mask and pretended he had just arrived to help Nancy. But by then, it was too late. Everything was already spiraling into chaos. Then came the tragic moment. Nancy, in a rush of fear and panic, accidentally stabbed Peter. Poor Peter. He was never supposed supposed to be part of this nightmare. He was dragged into it because of his selfish brother, Jake. But Nancy wasn't completely blameless either. If she had handled things differently, if she hadn't fired Jake so recklessly, maybe none of this would have happened. As Peter bled out, Jake ordered Jackson to keep an eye on Nancy while he and Bobby carried Peter inside to treat his wounds. But as Jackson let his guard down for just a moment, Nancy saw her chance. She ran toward the back of the restaurant, tripping over a bag of rotten meat. That's when an idea struck her. Meanwhile, inside, Jake desperately tried to stop Peter's bleeding. Bobby, now fully realizing how out of control things had become, quietly grabbed the police officer's car keys. He needed to find a way out before things got worse. At the same time, Nancy's father, still on his date, kept calling Jake to talk about the firing. Despite Nancy's emotional decision, her father had never actually planned to let Jake go. He just wanted to talk things over, maybe even ask Jake to stay, but it was already too late. Jake had gone too far. Nancy found herself in a tense chase with Jackson, narrowly dodging his attacks. In a desperate move, she threw hot oil at him, forcing him back. But in the end, she had no choice but to take his life to survive. Gasping for breath, she crawled under a table, her eyes darting across the blood-soaked floor. That's when she saw Bobby, lying motionless and drenched in blood. He had fought Jake, but had clearly lost. At that moment, Tabitha arrived, responding to Nancy's earlier call. But as soon as she saw the chaos inside, she panicked and ran away, leaving Nancy to fight alone. Ignoring Tabitha's escape, Jake focused solely on Nancy, who had bolted toward the storage room. The sun was beginning to rise as Nancy made a desperate break for freedom, but Jake was faster. He caught up to her, stabbing her from behind before dragging her back into the restaurant. He had no idea she was pregnant. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife into her stomach and left her there, thinking she was dead. But he was wrong. Nancy slowly opened her eyes, still alive. The rotten meat she had wrapped around her stomach earlier had absorbed most of the impact, preventing a fatal wound. Jake had been tricked. Struggling to her feet, she glanced at Bobby, barely clinging to life. And that's when she finally admitted the truth. The baby she was carrying was his, the result of a drunken night at a party. With no time to lose, Nancy grabbed the police car keys and made her way to Jake's house. She had to finish this. Without much effort, she caught Jake off guard, attacking him from behind and putting an end to his terror once and for all. Weak from blood loss, she stumbled back to the restaurant. Moments later, her father arrived, taking in the horrifying scene before. His voice trembled as he asked what had happened. Do you think Nancy made the right choices throughout the story? Or could she have done things differently to stop the chaos earlier? So, which awesome movie should we recap next? And if you enjoyed this recap, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more epic movie breakdowns. We've got plenty more coming your way. Thanks for watching and see you next time. This was Warner Movie Recaps, where movies come to life.